Welcome to the Theology Made podcast. In today's episode, we're going to look at the first Thanksgiving and the theology of gratitude. Close your eyes and picture the scene. Now you've seen it in 1,000 paintings. A long wooden table, pilgrims in black coats and buckled hats, Native Americans in feathered headdresses, everyone bowing their heads over a roasted turkey. That seems like it came right out of the oven. It's calm, peaceful, kind of familiar, almost like a Norman Rockwell painting dropped into the 1600s. But here's the problem. That picture is almost entirely myth. The real first Thanksgiving looked nothing like the holiday we know today. The Pilgrims didn't wear buckles, there wasn't a neat row of chairs, the food was not pumpkin pie and mashed potatoes, and they weren't playing Charlie Brown. And most importantly, the theology that shaped the Pilgrims' gratitude was radically different than our modern understanding of Thanksgiving. To grasp the first Thanksgiving, you have to step inside the minds of the Pilgrims. Their covenant theology, their sense of providence, their belief that every hardship was God's test and every blessing his mercy. And you also have to consider the Native Americans who sat beside them, whose spirituality and worldview clashed and intertwined with Puritan faith. This is the true story of the first Thanksgiving and the theology of gratitude that shaped it. The Pilgrims didn't set out to create a holiday. They weren't thinking about family traditions or future parades. The story begins with desperation, not celebration. In November of 1620, the Mayflower anchored off Cape Cod. After more than 2 months at sea, the passengers, separatists, seeking religious freedom alongside others chasing economic opportunity. They were exhausted. They had hoped to reach the warmer climate of Virginia, but storms forced them north. And what awaited them was not fertile farmland, but the barren, rocky coast of New England, with winter already closing in. The first winter in Plymouth was devastating beyond imagination. The Pilgrims had arrived too late in the season to plant crops. They faced bitter cold, inadequate shelter, and scarce food. Disease spread quickly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of their hastily built houses. Scurvy, malnutrition, sickness cut through the company. Of the 102 passengers who had left England, half were dead within months. Entire families perished, husbands buried wives, parents buried children, children buried parents. The colony was reduced to a handful of survivals struggling to care for the sick while burying the dead. William Bradford, who would later serve as governor, remembered with grim brevity, of the 100-and-odd persons, scarce 50 remained. So desperate was their situation that they buried their dead at night, quietly and in secret, so that nearby native tribes would not see how few remained. The fear of attack was constant. Every grave hidden, every body concealed was a measure of protection against potential enemies. And in that crucible of suffering, theology wasn't an abstract luxury. It was the only lens through which they made sense of reality. Every meal felt like borrowed grace. Every sunrise seemed like an undeserved gift. Every breath of survival was interpreted as the providence of God. And then came spring. Survival, they quickly learned, would not depend solely on their wits or resilience. It depended on the mercy of neighbors they had once feared. For the Wampanoag, weakened themselves by recent epidemics and threatened by rival tribes, their allegiance was more strategic. For the Pilgrims, it was life-saving. And at the heart of this alliance was one remarkable figure, Tisquantum, or you might know him as Squanto. Years earlier, Squanto had been kidnapped by English traders, sold into slavery in Spain, and eventually made his way to England. There he learned the language, worked in London, and eventually returned to his homeland, only to find his village wiped out by disease. He was a man caught between two worlds, fluent in English, familiar with European ways, yet still a child of the soil of Massachusetts. For the Pilgrims, his appearance was nothing short of miraculous. Here was someone who could interpret, mediate, and teach them how to survive. Squanto showed them how to plant corn in mounds, fertilize with fish to enrich the soil. He taught them where to find edible plants, how to navigate rivers, how to fish the waters, and hunt the forests. Bradford would later write with awe that Squanto was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. To Puritan eyes, Squanto wasn't just a helpful neighbor, he was providence embodied, God's sovereign hand reaching into their desperation to deliver them. By the fall of 1621, the tide had turned. The colonists had endured their first full year. Crops grew in their newly cleared fields, corn filled their storehouses, and the immediate threat of starvation receded. And the alliance with their new friends, though tenuous, held. And for the first time since leaving England, they faced the winter with food in reserve and hope in their hearts. To them, this was not coincidence. It's not luck. It wasn't chance. It was providence, God's hand guiding them through the valley of death into the land of survival. Every sheaf of corn was a sign of covenantal faithfulness. Every breath of life, proof that they were God's people, chosen and preserved in a new wilderness. In that sense, and that survival itself was grace, was the soil out of which the first Thanksgiving grew. So, what actually happened that autumn? Strip away the myths and the paintings, and you're left with one of the most remarkable and misunderstood episodes in early American history. The harvest of 1621 was cause for celebration. After the crushing famine of the previous year, the Pilgrims had food stored, fields harvested, and game from the forest to supplement their supplies. For a people who had nearly starved, this was nothing short of miraculous. They were alive, and to give thanks, they decided to hold a feast. One of the best sources comes from Edward Winslow, a leader among the colonists who later wrote,
"Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might, after a more special manner, rejoice together. After we had gathered the fruit of our labors,
those 4 hunters returned with enough wildfowl to feed the colony for days. It was likely ducks and geese rather than turkeys, which were harder to catch in large numbers. And to mark the occasion, the Pilgrims also fired muskets and cannons in festivity. That gunfire, however, startled their Wampanoag neighbors. Massasoit appeared with about 90 men, nearly double the number of surviving Pilgrims. So imagine being there. Fragile colony, barely established, suddenly surrounded by nearly 100 armed native men. The tension, to say the least, would have been palpable. But instead of conflict, something remarkable happened. The Wampanoag brought 5 freshly killed deer as gifts. They joined the feast, and for the next 3 days, the two groups shared food, games, and hunting. The menu is not what modern Thanksgiving tables hold. Alongside venison and wildfowl, alongside venison and ducks, there was maize, beans, squash, berries, nuts, and seafood, mussels, clams, maybe even lobster. They may have had pumpkins, but it wouldn't have been in pie form. The food was really going to be the food was a fusion of English methods and native ingredients, eaten not at one long table, but spread across outdoor gatherings, fires, and makeshift seating. It was less a single meal than a harvest festival, a rhythm both cultures understood, even if it was for different reasons. But beneath the shared celebration was a fragile reality. This alliance was not built on friendship alone, it was strategic. The Wampanoag had been devastated by disease brought by earlier European contact. Some estimates suggest the population had been cut in half. Surrounded by rival tribes and threatened by a powerful tribe in the west, Massasoit saw the armed English as potential allies. For the Pilgrims, still too weak to stand on their own, the Wampanoag's support meant survival. So gratitude was real, but so was suspicion. To the Pilgrims, the feast was proof of God's providence, a covenantal blessing after suffering. To the Wampanoag, it was both hospitality and a political gesture, a way of reinforcing alliances in a dangerous new order. So the first Thanksgiving was not a storybook picture of harmony. It was a truce, exchange of gifts, and a moment of shared humanity. And within a generation, relations would sour into distrust, conflict, and war. But in the fall of 1621, for 3 days, former strangers, potential enemies, sat side by side, ate from the same harvest, gave thanks, each in their own way, for survival. For the Pilgrims, gratitude wasn't a vague seasonal sentiment. It wasn't about pumpkin pies, family gatherings, or even a general sense of optimism. Gratitude was covenantal, theological, obedience. Puritan theology had trained them to read every single event as a message from the hand of God. They lived in a world saturated with providence. Storms at sea? Not accidents of weather, but deliberate tests from the Almighty designed to strengthen their faith. The death of half their company, either God's righteous judgment or his mysterious providence working through suffering in ways they could not fully see. The survival of the rest, pure mercy, undeserved grace keeping them alive when all odds were against them. And the harvest of 1621, not just agricultural success, but the very provision of God, covenant blessings poured out in response to their faithfulness. For the Pilgrims, there was no such thing as coincidence. Nothing was random. Everything, every breath, every illness, every stalk of corn, every drop of rain, was interpreted through the lens of covenant theology. And that shaped their understanding of gratitude, because gratitude was not an optional emotion you felt when things happened to go your way. It was an act of obedience, covenant duty. To be ungrateful was to break faith with God. To give thanks was to acknowledge his sovereignty and renew their trust in his promises. That's why their celebrations were framed not just by food, but prayer. In England, long before they ever crossed the Atlantic, Puritans had practiced days of thanksgiving. These were special worship services appointed after God delivered them from some particular crisis. Maybe it was deliverance from famine, recovery from plague, victory in war, or rescue from disaster. A day of thanksgiving wasn't set on the calendar like Christmas or Easter. It was appointed in response to God's action in history. In other words, thanksgiving was their reflex to providence. When God acted, his people gave thanks. That rhythm shaped the way Pilgrims saw the 1621 feast. They didn't invent Thanksgiving out of thin air. They carried with them an inherited Puritan habit of interpreting history as God's theater and responding with gratitude whenever he moved. For them, the feast wasn't just about survival. This was a theological declaration. It was a way of saying publicly together, we survived because God willed it. We harvested because God provided it. Therefore, he deserves our praise. In their minds, Thanksgiving was a kind of covenant renewal ceremony. It wasn't simply about feeling grateful. It was about reaffirming that God was their Lord, that they were his people, and that his providence was the only explanation for their existence. That's the Pilgrim lens on gratitude, a view of life where nothing is wasted, everything has meaning, and Thanksgiving is the rightful response to both hardship and blessing. But what about the Wampanoag? Their worldview was profoundly different. For them, the land was sacred. Every harvest was an act of balance with the natural world. Gratitude was directed not only to a creator spirit, but to the earth, animals, and cycles of nature that sustained it. Sharing food was an act of community and respect, not just survival. And when they sat with the Pilgrims, they weren't entering into a covenant with the Christian God. They were extending hospitality and reinforcing political alliance. For them, gratitude was woven into daily life and seasonal rhythms. The table of 1621 was therefore more than a meal. It was a collision of worldviews, covenant theology, and cyclical spirituality, providence, nature, divine sovereignty, ecological balance. And over time, the memory of this feast was reshaped. By the 19th century, writers and politicians turned the first Thanksgiving into a national myth, an image of peaceful coexistence, a foundation story of America. Lincoln, in 1863, proclaimed Thanksgiving a national holiday in the midst of the Civil War, hoping gratitude could heal a divided nation. But behind the myth is something richer. The Pilgrim's theology of gratitude reminds us that Thanksgiving is not about comfort, but survival. It's about seeing God's hand in the storm as well as the harvest. And the Wampanoag perspective reminds us that gratitude is also about connection to the land, community, and the cycles of life. The modern holiday often flattens these truths into turkey and football. But the theology of gratitude behind the first Thanksgiving was weighty, raw, and hard-won. So next time you sit at a Thanksgiving table, remember the real story. Remember the Pilgrims who buried half their company before they ever feasted. Remember the Wampanoag whose hospitality made survival possible. And remember that gratitude, in its truest sense, is forged in suffering and sustained in covenant. The first Thanksgiving was not the birth of an American holiday. It was an act of theology, an embodied declaration that even in loss, in wilderness, in uncertainty, God provides. And that's the theology of gratitude, not sentimental thanks for abundance, but covenantal trust in the God who sustains his people through scarcity, trial, and grace. Thanks for listening to the Theology Made podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and comment on whatever platform you're streaming on. This helps the algorithm gods out there know, hey, this is worth listening to.